Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I wanted to cover what I thought were the 10 best cards coming out of Azurite Sea. This is going to be a review of the most meta impactful cards, not necessarily the flashiest or, coolest effects, just cards that are overall solid, and I think you'll be a little surprised at this list, so let's go ahead and get started. The first card I would like to review is actually one that has a pretty high ceiling in my opinion, and that is the new Raya Kumandran Rider. This is a 4-cost inkable, 3 strength, 3 willpower character that quests for 2 that has a very unique ability that says whenever you ink a card per turn, you may ready chosen character of yours, and they can't quest for the rest of the turn. This is one of those cards that I've pointed out in the past that have a very high ceiling. And what I mean by that is when I said things like Ursula Deceiver of All is just a card that gets better over time, Tamatoa the same, Ariel Spectacular Singer, Morph, etc. The reason why this card fits into those or that category is simply because as you get more and more powerful cards that exert to execute very powerful abilities, we already have a couple, we'll go over those in just a second, but this card just gets better over time. It has solid stats and it quests for 2, which is relevant in and of itself already, but just imagine using something like the Queen's ability to get 2 items in a turn. Imagine using something like the Amber Gaston to reduce the character's cost by 4, potentially playing out a huge body, 4 turns early. Those are just some of the powerful interactions you have with this card already. Not only that, it can ready up a card you want to protect to prevent it from being challenged. It can do something like ready up the new Yzma to make you draw up to 6 cards in a turn, for example. The ceiling on this card is very, very high, and I do think it's worth grabbing your copies now. It hasn't really made too many waves as of the first weekend of Azurite Sea being released, but I do think long term this is a card that is very, very good and will come good just like Morph and Tamatoa and all these other cards have over time. Next card I want to go over is the White Rose. It is a 3-cost inkable amethyst card that is 3 strength and 3 willpower. It also quests for 1, but it has a very powerful ability, one that we've seen something like before with Merlin Goat, in that when you play this character you gain 1 lore. While this card is obviously inherently weaker than Merlin Goat, it does provide Amethyst with additional firepower to say, now I have so many different ways to gain lore without questing. You really have to make sure that you check me early on in the game, because if I do get to 15, 16 lore, I can very easily win the game off of top decks. This card comes down, gains you a lore. If it quests, it can gain you another lore. We know that Goat, when it gets bounced or just leaves the field in general, can gain you upwards of 3 lore, because if it hits the board, quest, leaves the field, that's 3 lore. So having more air quotes Goat-like interactions in an Amethyst deck just is very powerful. And it's not like this card is understated or anything. A 3-cost 3/3 body is still pretty reasonable for a very powerful effect like this, and it has no other restrictions. It can still quest, it can still do everything else. Again, just kind of like more copies of Goats in your deck to a certain degree, giving you 8 potential outs to top deck a card that says, I have instant lore gain, plus you have to deal with this threat because I'm going to just get another lore off of it next turn if I do quest with it. Very, very good card, and it's making its way into a number of decks. And what's actually kind of scary about a card like this is when you pair the Amethyst color with Emerald now, which is going to be the next color we look at with the card coming from it, the Amethyst Emerald deck looks like it really can, air quotes, burn you very, very effectively and come out of nowhere to win the game. Speaking of which, let's get into the next card, which is from Emerald. I'm pretty sure everybody saw this coming from a mile away, but Go Tomago might be the only real top Emerald card that came out of set 6. Now don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good cards in this set that I'm not covering in this top 10, and some of them do come from Emerald, but this card is so far and ahead of everything else Emerald got in this set, it is quite remarkable. Go Tomago is a 2-cost inkable, 2 strength, 2 willpower character with evasive, so right off the bat, it's kind of just like a really good card on the surface. It quests for 1, and it has an insanely powerful ability, especially to give Emerald this kind of ability is very, very interesting. When you play this character, you may pay an additional 2 to gain lore equal to the damage on chosen opposing character. Into decks like Emerald Amethyst and Emerald Steel, this now gives those decks, well, Amethyst Emerald always had it, but giving Emerald Steel an alternative win condition to just questing for game is very scary in my opinion, because one of the, I don't want to say checks for Emerald Steel, which we know is a very powerful deck. It won, 2 DLCs last format in set 5. It didn't really need any more tools, but at least you know, or you knew, that they still need a board, they still need a character in order to go for game. They could be at 19 lore, but if you can keep them off that character, they can't win the game. That's not the case anymore. If you have a damage character on a damage character on board, you now are threatened by the fact that they could Tomago you for game. And this card in Steel, as we know, can synergize very well with Steel songs such as Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, Zeus if they play it, and of course just from challenging. Into the Emerald Amethyst builds, drop a Fox, throw it into a Hiram, okay, put 4 damage on the Hiram, play a Tomago, gain 4 lore out of nowhere. This card is very scary, and after the fact, it's still a 2-cost, 2/2 evasive character, which makes it a little difficult to deal with. Yes, it gets brawled and storm raged and etc., but if it comes in and you've got the kicker ability off, you don't really care if your opponent has to waste a resource outing it, because you got 3, 4, or more lore off of this thing already. This card is very powerful and definitely the best Emerald card in my opinion coming out of Azurite Sea. There is no surprise here that Sail of the Azurite Sea makes it onto the top 10 list. It's honestly one of the best cards in the game, definitely top 3 out of this set. I don't want to go as far as saying it's the best card out of the set, but it's very close to being that. This 2-cost inkable action allows you to ink an extra card for the turn. It does have to be an inkable card, but the condition to draw the card, which is the second half of this text, does not depend on you fulfilling the first part of this effect. The first part of this effect, saying that you could ink an additional card, is almost like a floating effect. You activate Sail of the Azurite Sea, you actually just draw a card off of it. And then, if you want, you can then decide to ink the extra card for turn. This does a lot of things for Sapphire. We saw the impact that Tipo had in set 5. Being able to ink an additional card from your hand on turn 2 has been very powerful. Puts a character on board, which is kind of irrelevant given it's a 1/2 body. But the fact that it could ink an inkable card and just ramp you on turn 2 was very, very powerful. We saw people playing 1 jump aheads prior, a 2-cost uninkable song that allowed you to ink the top card from your deck. It was still negative card advantage because you play the card from your hand and you get ink for it. This card allows you to draw a card, so it instantly replaces itself. Then you have the choice to ink from hand, which again would be negative card advantage for the fact of getting extra ink, but it's not an uninkable card like 1 jump ahead was. And honestly, a card like this is not a bad top deck late into the game, whereas 1 jump ahead is a terrible top deck. This card is still ink, this card still replaces itself, and if your hand is big enough, even if you top deck this late in the game, you play it, it thins your deck for 1 because you draw, and then you can just say I can get the 2 ink back by just inking twice from my hand, and I have the same amount of ink I would have had last turn anyways to play out what I wanted. This card does a lot for Sapphire. The fact that it's inkable, the fact that it replaces itself, in my opinion, already make it better than Tipo and 1 jump ahead. And it's why you're going to start seeing this card everywhere in Sapphire decks. Over 1 jump for sure, over Mickey Mouse probably, and I think you still will play this in tandem with Tipo, because while this card is in my opinion better than Tipo, being able to ramp on turn 2 with either this or Tipo so that you have a setup for a very powerful turn 4 into a Hiram to pop the item you played on turn 1 just makes Sapphire way more consistent with what it wants to do, assuming you see the Hiram. Next up, we have Jim Hawkins, Rigging Specialist. This is a 5-cost, uninkable, 5 strength, 5 willpower character that can shift for 3 in Steel. It's an uncommon, but it also can quest for 2. And it has a nice little additional effect that says when you play this character, you may deal 1 damage to chosen character or location. This card is extremely strong. It is very good with sapphire steel in particular, but also good with other steel variations such as amethyst steel. The primary reason why this card is so good, especially in sapphire steel, is because the 2-cost shift target, which is an inkable Jim Hawkins 0/4 that has the ability of gaining Challenger 2 anytime you play a card from your hand into your inkwell, or just play a card into your inkwell. You have a good shift target on 2, and it curves out nicely to playing this on turn 3. What do we know about steel and 5-cost characters? They love to sing. A Whole New World and Grab Your Swords are now back into the meta. What's even better about something like Jim Hawkins is when you play this, you deal 1 damage to a character or location, but then if you decide to sing the Grab Your Swords from shifting this, you deal a total of 3 damage to a threat on the board in terms of a character, and then 2 damage to everything else. That is tremendous value. When you think back to the first chapter, one of the most powerful interactions in the game was shift Tinkerbell into singing Grab Your Swords, which dealt effectively 3 damage to everything on the board. You now have a similar line of play like that, but on turn 3, and you get a 5-cost, well, a cost doesn't matter if you're shifting it on 3, but you have a 5/5 body on board. This is very, very good. It will put a lot of pressure on your opponent, especially if you do shift it early. Being a 5/5 body is huge, and also questing for 2 is big. I don't even know how you would answer a card like this that early in the game. It is very strong, especially if you get it out on shift. Definitely, in my opinion, one of the better steel cards that we got in this set for Azurite Sea. The next card I want to talk about is Moana Self-Taught Sailor, a 1-cost inkable 3 strength, 2 willpower character that has a drawback ability that says this character can't challenge unless you have a captain character in play, but that's okay because you're just going to want to turn this sideways and quest for 1 the whole time anyways. This card is obviously very good in pirate-oriented decks that have captains, but honestly, just as a generic 1-drop for Ruby, this card finally gave Ruby a more viable 1-drop option than your vanillas, and without having to rely on your other ink pairings such as Ruby Amethyst to have your good 1-drops. This card coming down on field represents most likely a positive trade. Your opponent's likely going to have to either throw a bigger character, a higher cost character into this to stop it from questing for 3, 4, 5 for however long it sits on board, or take a turn, lose some tempo to sing songs in order to out this. Yes, it does lose to Let the Storm Rage On, but beside from that, it's a very specific interaction. This card can go the distance, and I've seen it because I've play tested it. I played this on turn 1, it never left the board, and I won with it still on the board by like turn 6 with like Ruby Amethyst. Not saying that it's played in that deck necessarily, because again, you're competing with a lot of very powerful Amethyst 1-drops as well. But this card finally gives Ruby some of its own identity as having a very powerful 1-drop that you could play. Plus, it has the Moana name, and we already have some decent shift targets for her, and undoubtedly, we're going to get better shift targets for her in the future. This card forcing a positive trade, most likely for you by having your opponent throw a 2 or 3 cost character into it, is all you really need to know, because they can't just leave this on board to continue to quest. It is a big threat and just an overall really good generic card coming out of Azurite Sea. Huge fan of a card like this. It's overstated for its cost. We already know, we've seen that before with Merlin, Goat, and with Madame M. Fox, and look how those cards turned out. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I've said I'm very high up on Merlin Crab now, and Diablo coming out is definitely one of the reasons why. On its own in isolation, this is a great card in and of itself. Yes, it doesn't trade into anything, it doesn't put damage on anything. It's just a 1-cost inkable 0/1 character that says when it's banished, you draw a card, and it quests for 1. If you've watched any of my videos, you've seen a couple of ways you can use this card to your advantage. You can generate extra card advantage by moving this to a location, just having a body on there. It helps you very nicely curve out your deck by playing additional 1-drops that are inkable. Very good, and it gives yet another very playable 1-drop in Amethyst, which is crazy. It's the best ink color for 1-drops, let alone other things like card draw. But what's really subtle about a card like this is you can use it with things like Merlin Crab to give it Challenger 3, and then you can use it to take out any X and 3 character, while you will also be able to replace this card by drawing a card in the process. That is an extremely powerful and underrated interaction, but just the fact that this thing can come down and say, I don't care if I get banished because I know I'm going to draw a card. You can quest with this, your opponent will waste some kind of turn or character challenging into it, or resource outing it with like a song or an ability of a character or something, and you're going to feel great about it because you're going to be like, either I got my lore, or at the very least I at least replaced it itself. Diablo, there's a reason why the foil copies are going for, as of right now, $10 a copy, which is insane. I do think that comes down, but definitely one of the better uncommons out of the set. Obviously, it's making my top 10 here as one of the most meta impactful cards coming out of Azurite Sea. And we've already seen that after the first weekend since the set was released and has been legal. We've seen this card pop up in the Amethyst Steel and Emerald Amethyst decks, which have been topping and winning some of the bigger tournaments held to date. The next card we need to talk about is a card that checks that Diablo quite heavily in the Calhoun Marine Sergeant. This is a 2-cost, uninkable, 3-strength, 2 willpower character with resist +1, and is, as if that wasn't good enough, it also has the ability during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you get to gain 2 lore. So right away, this card really jumps out at the fact that it's overstated, 3 strength for a 2 cost. It is uninkable, but that's fine. And it also has resist +1. This card, when it's good, it's the best card. Think about it against aggro decks. It trades out taking no damage from something like Maleficent. It takes out Simba Bodyguards, which is being played now because of the shift line in the new set. And it survives. Not only that, it's gaining new lore in the process, helping you keep pace with aggro. We all know how powerful Robin Hood Champion of Sherwood was. The issue is that this card is uninkable. The issue is that this card is not a good top deck in certain matchups. When you think about this card into Sapphire decks, particularly Sapphire Ruby, this card almost does nothing. You're going to play this, hopefully not, unless you're forced to, and you're going to just be questing for 1. When this card is good, it's the best card. When this card is bad, it's pretty bad. Nonetheless, I do think this card sees play in a lot of steel decks. It may not see play in something like Amber Steel Song, but I think there is a place for it in something like Amethyst Steel, and something like Emerald Steel, and even Sapphire Steel, depending on how you build those decks. This card is just a very powerful card overall, and like I said, when it's good, it's really good. The next card I want to talk about is the only Amber card, spoiler alert, on my list, and that is the new 2-cost inkable Lilo Escape Artist. This is a 1 strength, 2 willpower character that can quest for 2, but it has one of the most unique and powerful abilities we can probably see in the game of Lorcana, and that is the ability to play itself from the discard. The reason why this card is so strong is because in a simplified game state, in a game state where you and your opponent are outing each other's resources, if you do get down to that grind game, you have the constant advantage of bringing back a second interaction in a turn, assuming, let's say, you're both in top deck mode. You top deck your card, you play it, that's usually it. Well, with the Lilo in the discard pile, or more than 1 Lilo in the discard pile, you're also able to potentially play 2 interactions a turn. If your opponent is unable to deal with more than 1 interaction each turn, you're going to either set up the character you just top decked, or this Lilo is going to ready herself and then quest for 2. If your opponent does decide to deal with the Lilo, it throws off their tempo. Instead of questing, they have to challenge the Lilo. They take 1 damage in the process. Do that too many times, you lose your character. Not only that, the Lilo has potential combo potential with some of the new cards like Simba, the new one, legendary from set 6. I think it's called Pride Protector. If you have a Simba Pride Protector on field and it's exerted, and you've played this that turn, coming back from the discard, and it comes into play exerted, the Simba Pride Protector will ready this up. What's even more powerful, though, is when you start pairing this card with bodyguards. And there's one bodyguard in particular that's really going to see a lot of play, and it's one of the best cards coming out of Azurite Sea that we're going to take a look at right now. The sleeper pick out of Azurite Sea, and I don't know how much longer it's going to be a sleeper pick, is the new Pluto guard dog. This is a 4-cost inkable steel uncommon that has 1 strength and 5 willpower, has the bodyguard ability, quest for 1, but has a good boy ability that says when this character has no damage, he gets +4 strength. This card is a problem. It's going to see play in Amber Steel, many different variations of Amber Steel, including Amber Steel Song potentially. It will see play in Emerald Steel. It can see play in Sapphire Steel. It can see play in Amethyst Steel. This is probably the best steel card out of the set, eclipsing something like Jim Hawkins and Calhoun, in my opinion. And the reason for that is because of what this card facilitates on 4. On turn 4, you get a 5/5 bodyguard. That means you can protect something like an Ursula Deceiver of All. That means you can protect small Lilos and Daisy Ducks and Piglets and you name it on the aggro side from challenging. And it means if your opponent wants to out this, they're likely throwing 2 characters into it. Similar to what we just discussed with the Lilo. Being able to bring that Lilo back every turn while you have this Pluto bodyguard on board, good luck trying to get to the Lilo. You're going to have to throw 2 characters into this Pluto, most likely, which means that that's 2 characters that you could have either quested with or taken out other relevant threats with. And whatever you throw into this Pluto, at least the first card, while this is a 5/5, for 4, you're likely losing the card that you throw into this first. Now, this is another reason why I think Merlin Crab is coming back into the meta. The ability to give Challenger +3 is pretty huge in my opinion. And that can help you single-handedly interact with Pluto and out it. And I do think that you will need to do that because this card is just that good. The ability to protect your board on turn 4 with such an overstated character, the fact that this card will demand 2 cards being thrown into it, the fact that this card will positively trade out 2 for 1 most of the time because what you throw into it first will die. This card is very good. This card is extremely good. And you will see it being popped up into the meta all over the place in my opinion. 4 viable steel decks: Emerald Steel, Amber Steel, Amethyst Steel, and Sapphire Steel. And I think this card is included in Amber and Emerald Steel at the very least. It is my pick for, honestly, top 3. What do we have so far in top 3? Sail the Azurite Sea and this card. So that means the final card must be my final top 3 card in the set. And the final card is, of course, the new Genie Wish Fulfilled. For Amethyst and Steel to really get the short end of the stick, air quotes, in terms of their legendaries and supers, is totally okay. Because Amethyst and Steel occupy 6 out of the 10 slots on my list, and I think a lot of players would agree that each of the cards we reviewed in these ink colors deserve a spot here. Genie can make any Amethyst deck good. Pluto can make any steel deck better. And so on and so forth with the cards that we've reviewed in this list as well. The thing about Genie that will cause it to be one of the best cards in the set, one of the best cards in Amethyst, is similar to what Merlin Rabbit did when it was released in Rise of the Floodborn. Not to say that Genie will make an air quotes tier 0 format, but it will replace Rabbit. And I was on the fence about whether it would or not. But when you take a look at how this meta is shaping up and what's developing, the game is very fast now, and Rabbit is very slow. This card having evasive is also pretty important. Obviously the biggest thing here is that it quests for 2, whereas Rabbit only quests for 1. But Genie is not to be overlooked. Again, a very good combination piece with Crab, but mostly you want to quest with this. Genie represents card draw. It replaces itself, not to the same efficiency as Merlin Rabbit, because it will only draw 1, not draw when it leaves the field or gets bounced to replay, etc. If you bounce it and replay it, you'll still only draw 1, not 2 or 3 from that interaction. But you don't need to do that anymore. This card is insanely good, especially on follow-up in Amethyst Steel and Amethyst Ruby, where you've done some kind of board stabilization, board wipe, and then you drop Genie. Your opponent will have a tough time answering this. While it is a brawl target, it can get double stormed off of an Ursula Deceiver of All. That still costs your opponent tempo to deal with your board state. Then you can just reestablish another threat next turn. If this card goes unanswered, it's going to be questing for a lot. And another interaction that a lot of people don't think about, I think, or they'll start thinking about it for sure as they see it appear in the meta over and over again, is the fact that this card also gives Amethyst, particularly Ruby Amethyst, a natural check to Diablo. You no longer have to play awkward cards like Peter Pan Shadowfinder and so on and so forth. You now have another I'll call it in-engine answer to Diablo, which is one of the cruxes of Amethyst. Honestly, Diablo is like Maxi. It's an insanely broken card. But Genie being able to challenge into a Diablo is very relevant now. This card is very good. One of the top 3 cards in the set in my opinion. And with that, those are my top 10 cards coming out of Azurite Sea. Not too many super rares, I think only 1. Not too many rares, I think only 2, 3. Raya, Calhoun, Genie. Oh, and Tomago, 4. A lot of commons and uncommons. No legendaries. Now don't get me wrong, we got some really cool legendaries, but I just want to end by saying I think Ravensburger is doing a very good job with the way that they're making this game accessible and playable to the wider player base. Legendaries are cool because they're really cool effects, very powerful effects that you can build around, but they're not meta warping cards. And we've seen some other games really isolate player bases because they print staple cards, cards that everybody needs in high rarities that are very hard to get, and you have to spend a lot of money in order to play, if you want to play competitively. That is not the case with Lorcana. We've seen budget decks do very, very well. And with some of the best cards that they decided to release in Azurite Sea, and in other sets to be fair, being lower rarity, that is a trend I hope they continue to do. And one other thing that I am a big fan of with Ravensburger, and props to them for knowing this, is they've often released meta-relevant cards in starter decks, because the Tomago is also a card in a starter deck. We've seen Mim Fox and Hiram, etc. be cards in starter decks as well. And this has really helped the accessibility of cards that people need in order to play. Mim Snake, or Mim Fox, sorry, is still a pretty decently expensive card. Could you imagine if it was not in a starter deck, how much it would cost? But anyways, that's going to wrap up this video. We're coming up to 30 minutes. If you've made it this far, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.